Well, greetings from Harding University. This presentation is going to cover a brief history of art curriculum development since the middle part of the 20th century up to the present. So to begin the presentation, I'd like by posing this question: what curriculum approach should I use today? Well, that answer is influenced by many things, including but not limited to the following. The school district, curriculum guidelines, your personal philosophy on art education, and your views on the role of the art teacher. There have been 5 curriculum movements over the last 75 years, and I've been teaching 50 of those 75 years. The first one I'll address is Victor Lowenfeld's, Victor Lowenfeld, and what became of art education, largely influenced by Lowenfeld. He wrote a book, Creative and Mental Growth. It was first published in 1947, and many art teachers my age that was used as a textbook for their, particularly art in the elementary classes, but also there's some even on the secondary level because Lowenfeld covered secondary level art education. Take a look at the overview of the approaches, and then we'll dive back into Lowenfeld. Another movement began I saw it in the 1970s, the behavioral movement. Performance objectives or behavior objectives began earlier because of the Industrial Revolution and education adopting some of the philosophy of quotas. And so public school teachers have had to write behavioral or otherwise known as performance objectives for most of their teaching careers. And it's now hit the college level for the last decade or so. College professors are also required to write these objectives. Well, in the mid-80s, it began a little earlier than that, or the foundation for it, but the 1980s, early 90s saw the discipline-based art education movement, DBAE. It was funded by the Getty Center, and it was all the rage. There was some negative backlash to it, but a very important movement. A lot of our curricula in textbooks today is based on DBAE. Visual culture came in, started seeing this term a lot in the 1990s, and it overlapped with the next movement to come along. But visual culture, that is, anything and everything in our culture is a legitimate subject for art. We aren't limited so much with the traditional history of art. According to visual culture, everything out there that's visual should be incorporated in the classroom. And what's happening right now is social justice. If you look at the topics on the agenda for the meeting here in San Antonio, a lot of it is social justice oriented. So we'll walk through these. Victor Lowenfeld's Creative Mental Growth. He wrote the book in 1947, or was published then. I have these Google hits at the top of these slides, and how it's changed over time, how many Google hits you'll get for some of these terms. It's kind of interesting. Well, several generations of art teachers and elementary classroom teachers were trained with using creative and mental growth. The developmental stages that Lowenfeld identified through his research is used to train art therapists even today. Well, you really cannot adequately understand children without children's art, their development of their visual skills without an understanding of these stages that Lowenfeld identified. Well, what is art for children? Art for the adult is usually concerned with aesthetics and the end product. Art for the child, these are quotes from Creative and Mental Growth, by the way. Art for the child is primarily a means of expression. It's a child's process, thinking, feeling, and perceiving that are important. Thinking, that's cognition. Feeling, that's emotion. Perceiving, being able to see. Those are critical to art, and art is one of the few areas in education that deal with all three of those. In art, there are no right or wrong answers. Art education is primarily concerned with the process, whereas fine arts are more concerned with the product. Again, this is all Lowenfeld's writing. It is not the adult's answers that are but the child striving toward the answer that is crucial. And he developed his developmental stages. Scribbling stage, which has three subcategories: uncontrolled, controlled, and named. And the pre-schematic stage, the schematic stage, and the dawning realism stage. The dawning realism is the latter part of middle school. For some, the dawning realism stage marks the end of their natural artistic development. In fact, a lot of adults draw on that age level, that 9 to 12-year-old, as far as their ability to draw realistically. And then the pseudo-naturalistic stage, or the stage of reasoning, begins around the age of 12 and persists through high school years. Excuse me. Scribbling stage, this is an example of disordered scribbling. Some of these are my own children's drawings. Some are what I've collected over the years. Controlled scribbling, where the child is deliberately making marks, a lot of circular motifs. It's primarily a kinesthetic activity. The name scribbling stage, where these marks, still pretty much just scribbles, but child starts naming them. It's a change from kinesthetic thinking to imaginative thinking. It's a critical time in human development, and really what sets us apart from other animals is that this abstract thinking, naming these marks on the page. The pre-schematic stage, 4 to 7 years old, the child is consciously creating form. This graphic communication is beginning. Whereas scribbling was mainly a kinesthetic activity, now the child is representing something. And the first symbol is typically a person. Early stages in pre-schematic are going to be circles with arms and legs protruding, much like this diagram on the top. The schematic stage, you may have some of these on your refrigerator at home if you have small children. We call this symbol a schema if it is repeated again and again with a little change in the symbol, a schema. Typically a baseline, maybe blue sky across the top. This is a typical schematic stage. Personally, I think pre-schematic and schematic are both just schematic, early and a later schematic, but I didn't write the book. The schematic stage has several types of art. This baseline aspect of it, the folding over, where the child will turn the page so they have potentially four different baselines in their drawing. Plan and elevation, looking at a top view and a side view of different elements simultaneously. This top view of a swimming pool, side view of the trees. It's pretty typical of children's work in this age, and in fact, sometimes I run into this in my college level art classes, where a person will draw a cylindrical object with the top of it too round because they know it as a circle, not as an ellipse. And x-ray pictures where you see what's going on in the house and what's going on outside of the house. Sometimes it'll be a skeleton and inside of the human figure. But x-ray pictures, part of schematic. Space-time representations, where a child will incorporate different events in the same page, different places in the same page, space and time. Really advanced abstract thinking. The dawning realism stage, otherwise called the gang age, because children do get kind of cliquish, little groups of boys or groups of girls. And children gain a feeling for detail. They often lose a feeling for some of the spontaneity and action you see in, or just spontaneity you see in younger children's work. It may become a little stiff. They begin to be more rigid in their color-object relationship. Parenthetically here, Lowenfeld maintained that there is no place in elementary school for teaching color theories by means of color wheels or other such aids. I've always wondered about that since the child is now concerned with color. Why not start teaching it? Well, studies have shown that there's a surprising similarity between drawings by children during this stage and by adults who have had little formal training. Then comes the pseudo-naturalistic stage, beginning at approximately 12. There are two creative types that Lowenfeld identified. The visual becomes familiar with the environment primarily through eyes and feels like a spectator, or the haptic, concerned primarily with body sensations and subjective experiences, emotion. There's concerted effort to mimic reality in the pseudo-naturalistic stage. Lowenfeld felt very strongly about creativity and the importance of creativity in the classroom. He said, every child is born creative. Probably the most crucial time in the encouragement of creative thinking is when the child is beginning formal schooling. Best preparation for creativity is the act of creation itself, and the relationship between intelligence test and convergent thinking, where as a creativity test would attempt to measure divergent thinking. And Lowenfeld identified 8 traits of creativity. I won't read them off here. You see these in other areas of education. Well, Lowenfeld on art in the elementary. Children should have ample opportunity to express their own relationship to their environment. Classroom procedures should be kept flexible. Important as skills and techniques may be, they must always remain the means to the end and never become the end in themselves. Any material that's used with children must fit their needs of expression. If a task can be done more easily and effectively by something different, some other media, then you're using the wrong media. And in no instance should the lack of material stand in the way of a good art program. This is all Lowenfeld, and most of this is advice that I think a lot of art teachers would agree with. More on the elementary art teacher. In teaching art to children, the most important element is the teacher, for the teacher has the important task of providing an atmosphere conducive to inventiveness, exploration, and production. The art teacher should be a warm and friendly person. The art teacher should give guiding suggestions, asking the children for their opinions and judgments. Well, Lowenfeld does spend time talking about secondary art teachers. Again, although this textbook was more often than not used for elementary classroom teachers or elementary art teachers. To secondary art, Lowenfeld said, unquestionably, the art teacher has a favorable position in schools, often able to run a different type of classroom without the wrath of the administration falling upon their heads. Well, we are given latitude. The teacher must have a genuine faith in students. He or she must provide an atmosphere where creativity can be fostered and where external evaluation is absent. Interesting. The teacher cannot be a threat to the student. Probably true. Lowenfeld on color. It's easy to see that young teenagers have become very aware of design qualities. This increased awareness of design is sometimes used as an excuse to teach the formal elements of design, which Lowenfeld wasn't very big on that. He's more into creativity. And I would disagree with him. I think the formal elements are appropriate for middle school and up, but not overly heavy technical aspects of it. Well, positive and negative. My personal critique on Lowenfeld, on the positive side, Lowenfeld recognized and emphasized the unique quality of creativity and the role of the art teacher in encouraging and developing creative potential. Much of what Lowenfeld outlined in his text was based on observation and research as opposed to anecdotal evidence and or opinion. The developmental stages are easily observed in children. And Lowenfeld believed that the child must be able to identify with the subject at hand. That is, art should be an expression of personal experience. Those are the positive things about Lowenfeld. Well, on the negative side, in his zeal for creativity and expression, he insisted that the formal language of art, the elements, principles of design, composition, were not an appropriate pedagogic topic, even when students were inquisitive about the formal aspects of creativity. This is going to fly in the face of the discipline-based movement we'll talk about in a little bit. Children from the dawning realism age and older recognize and would like to produce art that is sometimes expressive and sometimes descriptive. To deny them the tools to be descriptive artists when that is what they want, I think is detrimental to their aesthetic growth. Well, performance objectives came into the picture probably before I started teaching, but I became keenly aware of them in the 1970s as we were forced to write performance objectives for every lesson. They became known to many art educators through a book titled Preparing Instructional Objectives. It was published in 1962. It's during the 60s and early 70s that many public school teachers were required to write these behavioral objectives. That information that quote came from Florida State, their website. And this movement rose out of the outside broader area of education. It was across the board in education, but it influenced the way our teachers plan their curricula. So what are performance objectives? Well, or behavior objectives. There are three components: the condition, the performance, and the criteria. I've outlined the conditions, performance, and the criteria independently here, but putting it all together, given the primary colors, a number 5 round brush and poster board conditions there, the student will mix. Mix is the performance. It's observable. The secondary and tertiary colors and create the color wheel with all colors in the correct relationship. The criteria to recognize whether they were successful. That's pretty much convergent learning too. And we'll come back to that. Well, Elliot Eisner's response to behavioral objectives. If you're not familiar with Elliot Eisner and you're an art teacher, you probably need to do some reading. He was one of the major voices in art education for most of the second half of the 20th century. In an effort to bring balanced education, by the way, Elliot Eisner was big in education internationally, not just art education. He was also the president of the NAEA for a while. He wrote an article on for art education, for the periodical Art Education, entitled "Do Behavioral Objectives and Accountability Have a Place in Art Education?" It's a great article. I recommend that you look it up and read it. Came out in May of 1973. It's my second year of teaching. He outlined 3 types of objectives, not just behavioral. Behavioral objectives, talked about them. Then expressive objectives, The expressive activity is not prescriptive, it is evocative. An encounter is designed that on completion will become a post facto expressive objective. And then he outlined what he called type 3 objectives. I've been calling these problem solving objectives because that's what they are. And it's in fact a lot of what we do in an art classroom. We lay out a problem for the students and we set some parameters, and their creative activity is solving that problem. It could be a still life. Could be a design problem. The student is given a problem and set of parameters. Their solution is the objective, though unknown by the teacher at the onset. Their solution becomes the object, the objective. Design problems are typical of this approach. Well, that kind of brings us to this convergent versus divergent. In my critique of performance objectives, on the positive side, accountability was the primary argument for using behavioral objectives, and accountability is important in the art classroom. That is, if you want to be funded and if you want that art class to be there after you're gone. There are convergent and divergent types of learning, even in the art classroom. And both of them have their place in the art classroom. Well, in convergent, name the primary colors, or who painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling? Those are divergent. That's divergent. I'm sorry, my apology. Those are convergent. But a lot of art problems are divergent, where each student's solution is different than the other student's solution. We don't want cookie cutter answers to a design problem. Performance objectives can serve a positive role in the convergent realm of learning, and I've mentioned a couple here. So that's the positive side of performance objectives. On the negative side, an attempt to reduce education, particularly art education, to a series of behavioral or performances seriously deprives the student of a meaningful education. The rigor and time required to write effective performance objectives can deprive a teacher from what might be more important class preparation. Brings us to the next art movement. I began my doctoral work in 1980, worked on it for 2 years, 1985, and at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And I was really encouraged to wrap DBAE into my doctoral dissertation. I chose not to. I actually studied the effect of blind contour drawing on naturalistic drawing ability, which, by the way, is another presentation I've made at the National Convention. But this discipline-based education was really big in the middle of the 1980s. It's formalized by the Getty Center for Art Education, funded by the Getty Center. Central premise is sequential knowledge, presentation of sequential knowledge and skills, and DBAE, discipline-based art education, had 4 subcategories or subdisciplines: art production, the artist; art history, art historians; art criticism, art critics; aesthetics, aestheticians. DBA is not a specific curriculum. One of the major problems a lot of art teachers had was they felt like it was a specific type of curriculum being crammed down their throats. And some excerpts from DBAE should be viewed as a subject within general education with a written, sequentially organized curriculum. This was to give it accountability. Implementation of art education on a district-wide basis with appropriate administrative support, staff development, and material resources. They, in fact, funded the training of administrators and elementary classroom teachers in order to better understand a discipline-based art education. and it encouraged creativity since it is the source of works of art. However, it embraces creativity not for its own sake, but for its contribution to making and understanding art. Through DBAE, a child's creativity is enhanced by skills and concepts required through a substantive curriculum. That key to DBAE was substantive. They wanted meat in the curriculum. It is desirable to maximize the art specialist time with students by making the general classroom teacher a collaborator. So a lot of art teachers felt threatened by making the elementary classroom teacher a collaborator in the art program, but when you think about it, that's got to be a good thing to have the classroom teacher also involved in art instruction. In those schools without art specialists, that meant that elementary classroom teachers were trained to offer a DBAE arts program. Elliot Eisner, back to Elliot Eisner, had things to say about discipline-based art education. This was quotes from a conversation with Ron Brandt and presented by Ron Brandt, I think in the 1993 National Convention. I probably went to that session. Unlike mathematics, the arts have too often suffered from being without goals, without structure, without any sense of continuity and development. The arts need more purpose and continuity. Statement made there. When asked how criticism enters in, criticism pertains to growth in perception, growth in seeing. Ron Brandt asked Eisner, if discipline-based art education succeeds, what results do you expect? Eisner's response, if a sound art education program were implemented effectively in schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, youngsters finishing school would be more artistically literate. He also said, I have no doubt that the provision of continuity and sequence in learning is appropriate for art teaching. We need both structure and magic in art education. Well, my own critique. On the positive side, DBAE provided accountability in its insistence on sequential learning of stated concepts, provided solid career education and preparation, and it recognized and methodically addressed a broader concept of art disciplines than that of solely art production. DBAE, it could be argued, attempted to teach too much too soon. On the negative side, this is me speaking again, it appeared to ignore the developmental stages and wanted to plug in too much, even like simple color theory on kindergarten or first grade level. I see no use for teaching the art elements and principles to children in kindergarten through first or even maybe second grade. DBAE forced the distinction between aesthetics and criticism in the attempt to define four distinct disciplines, with aesthetics being defined by the formal qualities of art, as opposed to aesthetics theory, which related to art criticism. I think this was a bit of a stretch. Aesthetics is its own discipline, but it is not restricted to the elements and principles of art, which is what DBAE largely was promoting. DBAE might have been too focused on convergent learning as opposed to divergent learning. The right-brained intuitive art teachers were probably the ones who took issue with the movement. Well, visual culture, I started seeing the term a great deal in the 1990s, and it's still out there, but it's actually morphed into social justice. Notice the hits there on an internet Google search. In 2009, there were almost 43 million. In 2023, there's 931 million hits. Well, that's a lot of people talking about visual culture. And it's not restricted to the visual arts, certainly not. Well, the definition in Wikipedia: visual culture is a field of study within cultural studies, focusing on aspects of culture that rely on visual images. Well, we are bombarded with visual images today, particularly since the cell phones and the internet. Among cultural studies theorists working with contemporary culture, this often overlaps with film studies and the study of television, although it can also include video game studies, comics, traditional art media, advertising, internet, and other media that has a crucial visual component. More from Wikipedia. Early work on visual culture was done by Berger, don't know how to pronounce his name, and Mulvey. Major work on visual culture is also done by Mitchell, particularly in his books Iconology and Picture Theory. Other writers like Hall and Zizek were authoring on visual culture. In 2012, when I first presented a version of this presentation, several major universities were either housing or were developing graduate programs in visual studies, and I've listed them here. Notice several are in California, a very progressive state, and suggestions there for other reading that will overlap with visual culture. So, what is visual culture? Well, anything in our culture that is visual. From a lecture by Richard Griffiths, this quote that I'm going to give from 2002, he said, "In my lecture today, I'm going to explore the world of televised wrestling. Although this hybrid form of sports entertainment may seem a world away from the field of visual culture, I will demonstrate to you how professional wrestling offers a rich textual and visual terrain with which to engage. I start with the consideration of how the notion of spectacle and carnival applies to televised wrestling." Well, NAEA inquiry response: visual culture is a term that describes the imagery found in places such as magazines, newspapers, etc. Concern for visual culture is expanding because of the proliferation of electronic media and visual information. Due to its enticing format and social content, it is increasingly fundamental to the cultural transformation of social interaction, political discourse, and cultural identity. The theme for the 2010 convention in Baltimore was art education and social justice. So you can see at that point it was considered pretty important to art education. The School of Art Institute of Chicago had this quote: "Our program uses a visual culture approach and a social justice framework. For our students, I point out that social justice always more possibility than accomplishment, but that it always includes these themes: democracy, activism, history, public space, self-awareness, social literacy, and imagination. Work in a social justice vein always has two parts: analysis and action." That action part I find intriguing. It really plugs in with the social justice. Working or teaching for social justice requires attention to the complex context of people's lives and engaged responses aimed at change. That, for me, is where visual culture comes in. I won't take the time to read the next paragraph there. Put this program on pause and read it. But I do want to insert this. This response to change has made its way into the art classroom, and there's a negative aspect of that, as I'll talk about here in just a little bit. Excuse me, the social justice issue has come in now, but we're really still talking about the visual culture movement. Here was a negative reaction to it. This isn't my personal critique. This is by Camus. Not sure about the pronunciation, but at the NAEA convention in Minneapolis in 2003. Anything visible is a potential object of study for visual culture, and the worthiness of any visual object or practice as an object of study depends not on its inherent qualities, as in the work of art, but on its place within the context of the whole culture. In other words, one can henceforth treat the Nike of Samothrace and Michelangelo's David, say, on a par with Mattel Toys' Barbie and Ken dolls. What he was seeing in visual culture, and I saw it too, the art teacher now treating Barbie and Ken dolls, or just as an example, any other bit of trivia or even kitsch from society on equal foundation or of equal importance in the art classroom as the great works of art. Part of this is wrapped into part of this is a reaction against white European, historically white European art, our cultural foundation, but still there's been a negative reaction to it. The visual culture movement is primarily social and political in its motivation, aiming quite explicitly at the reconstruction of American society. Its influence is not only likely to dull the next generation's aesthetic sensibilities and further debase the general level of culture, but may extend far beyond the arts themselves. This is, again, a quote from that presentation, which was given a rather negative light or perspective to visual culture. Well, my own critique. On the positive side, popular culture has, in many times and many places, been the subject of art. I present The Wedding Dance by Peter Bruegel, 1566. That was visual culture, genre, everyday things. This link between the everyday stuff of life is visual culture, and it has always been a part of the arts, the visual arts. Art can and should give young people the tools to be better consumers of art and participants in our culture. Discussions of visual culture can enhance these skills. On the positive side, I think the problem is when you camp out on visual culture as the major theme for your curriculum. The negative side, there appears to be a concerted effort to eliminate distinctions such as fine art and applied art. There are differences between the purpose, the reason for fine art or the reason for applied art. And terms like high art, or terms of like good art and bad art, are thought to be bad distinctions by many. The claim is there is just visual culture, and let's take the qualitative out of it. I see that as highly problematic. An approach to visual culture that excludes the teaching of what has been recognized as the great art of all cultures, not just Western culture, the great art of all culture, is shooting oneself in the foot. And we could very likely see very serious consequences for the future of art education. From the standpoint of art education, the overriding objection to this movement is its blatant disregard for essential differences between works of visual art and other types of visual cultural artifacts. If there is not a distinction between art and other things in culture that are visual, if there is no distinction, then there is no such thing as visual art. As an art teacher, is that really what you want to communicate? A current major cultural trend in the last several years is social justice, and it spawned off of visual culture. This cultural trend has found its way into the art classroom. Although social justice issues are likely as old as humanity, we're going to look at it in the context of art education as a movement, how social justice issues are shaping the content of our art classrooms. So what is social justice? Social justice refers to a political and philosophical theory that focuses on the concept of fairness in relations between individuals and society and equal access to wealth, opportunities, and social privileges. The concept of social justice first arose in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, as attempts were made to promote more egalitarian societies and reduce the exploitation of certain marginalized groups due to the vast disparity between the rich and the poor at the time. There's a lot of good in that from a social, cultural perspective. There's a lot of good intent here. Social justice is based on the concepts of human rights and equality and involves a great degree of economic egalitarianism through progressive taxation, income redistribution, or even property redistribution. Social justice is the driving force behind some of the current curriculum strategies. Social justice is a legitimate concern for artists and one that has much historical precedent. From an art history standpoint, however, focusing the purpose of the art classroom on the social and or political agenda of a single person or group of people has implications that go beyond the social justice issues. In fact, it could be a fast track to undermining the very legitimacy of art in the public schools. If all we become are advocates for social justice, I think the administration is going to take a long, hard look at whether that art program is really necessary. Because you can cover social justice in English class, sociology class, PE class, you name it. Well, there are a lot of very legitimate social justice issues. This is not a comprehensive list, but there are environmental issues, civil rights issues. Black lives do in fact matter. Sexual identity, LGBTQ plus is on the airwaves all the time right now. Disability rights, the feminist movement, earlier called women's liberation, criminal justice, immigration issues, children's advocacy, family advocacy, and that list could extend 3 or 4 slides long. Whoops. Well, on the positive side, social justice is a legitimate and age-old issue for artist content, any artist content, and much of our content today might be on social justice issues. Students should be encouraged to include content that is meaningful to them. And some social justice assignments would be very appropriate, I think, in the classroom. However, there's a difference between assigning on the negative side. There's a difference between assigning a theme, such as social justice, to students for an art project, and the teacher prescribing a specific social justice theme or sub-theme, whether it's social, political, or religious. If it has implications and social, political, or religious implications that go against the student's conscience or is contrary to the beliefs of a significant portion of the local population, as a public school teacher, you're a problem, or you have a problem, because you are a employee of the state. Sorry about that, but you are, if you're paid with tax money. The art classroom should be about teaching students how to do art, encouraging them to develop their personal voice, not to indoctrinate them with the teacher's personal beliefs. And that goes for anyone, conservative, liberal, you name it. The art classroom is not an appropriate place to use as a bully pulpit. Well, all of these social justice movements and or causes have merit, and all of them are legitimate themes for the content of our students' art production, and obviously for the art of any individual artist, even for the art teachers as an artist. But are they what you, as the art teacher, should be teaching in the art classroom? You may feel strongly about an issue, but other people feel strongly about maybe the same issue on the other side. Should our classrooms become a soapbox for political, social, and or religious agenda? If so, Whose agenda? Yours or your community's? If yours, what is the argument for art advocacy when the school district is looking for ways to save money and there are programs to cut when your personal agenda goes against the grain of the community? Well, so that, how do you look at this whole thing, this curriculum thing, and what I'm saying here? What is the role of the art teacher? Well, I've always enjoyed presenting a continuum to students to look at what are the extremes in one direction or the other. So if you think of the teacher, teacher could be viewed as an authoritarian voice for the state on art, on what to teach and how to teach it. Authoritarian approach. On the other end, teacher is a social activist with an agenda. And along another area of this, or actually the opposite of authoritarian, is the laissez-faire. Anything goes. It's a little bit different than social activist, but yeah, find a middle ground on almost any curriculum is helpful. The teacher is a public servant and a public employee because that's what we are. So the balanced teacher will be committed to the development of their students' art skills and knowledge. The development of their students' art skills and art knowledge, not primarily social justice, although those are important things, but in the classroom, it's the development of skills and knowledge. That's what teachers ought to be about. Those skills and knowledge that will enhance their role as a consumer of design products, enrich their lives through the knowledge and skills in art, I should say, and art history, provide a foundation for vocational and avocational pursuits in art. I've always told my future art teachers that if you're teaching art in the public school, yes, you have a few of them where you're dealing with their vocation down the road. I always enjoyed teaching my high school students when I taught that level because I was the one that lit the fire under them to be an artist. And some went ahead to pursue art in college or professionally. But for the most of your students in the public schools, and maybe even a lot of them in college, your contact with the students is going to be giving them richer avocational pursuits. Yeah, hobbies, pursuit other than a vocation, and that's okay. So, artist versus art teacher, they're not opposed to each other. We can be both. As an artist, we have every right to influence our audience with whatever agenda we like within legal parameters. As an art teacher, in the public schools, at least, we do not have the right to use our position as a bully pulpit to promote our personal, social, or religious issues, unless the issue is adopted by the school district and, by extension, the community as the worthy educational goal. For instance, if your administration and your school board are really on board for helping do something about the homeless people in the community, then climb on board as the art teacher. Make that a project for the art class because everybody's on board with it. So, but you have to be discerning. And since I talked about a bully pulpit here, I just had to include Pisano's pulpit in the Pisa Baptistry. Well, one more thought, and I'll bring this to a close. What type of curriculum should I adopt? My advice is to use the best of what the history of art education has to offer. These items I covered or other movements, historical aspects that you're aware of. I like to use weaving as a metaphor. I did a presentation using weaving as a metaphor for art curriculum at a national convention. You can create the warp of your curriculum with those topics and skills that are embedded in your school district's curriculum, or even your own. You can create the warp, the main things. It could be some art history, it could be the elements and principles of art, it could be drawing skills. That would be the warp that kind of holds it all together, holds the fabric of the curriculum together. And in that fabric, then, you can weave Lowenfeld, DBA, visual culture, social justice, all kinds of things. Well, I thank you for your time, and have a good day.